To you, Don.
Okay, thank you, Jerry, and welcome to the third and final lecture in the series History of Anti-Semitism. You may remember the first lecture was on the origins of anti-Semitism, and last week we looked at anti-Semitism in America from colonial times till the end of World War II. So tonight we will examine the anti-Semitism in America since 1945. So I think it's safe to say that it's not an exaggeration that for many Jews in America today, the level of palpable fear, anger, and vulnerability is higher today than in recent memory. Attacks, whether verbal, physical, or in some cases even fatal, have come from the far right in our own society. Hateful tweets, synagogue shootings, a former president hosting white nationalists and Holocaust deniers, all of that has left many American Jews distressed. Now, according to the Anti-Defamation League, in 2021, it was the highest year on record for documented reports of anti-Semitic harassment, vandalism, and violence. And the ADL said that 2022 will look a lot like 2021. They haven't come up with their final statistics yet. In 2020, a Pew Research poll found that 6 in 10 Jews reported having had a direct personal experience with anti-Semitism in the past 12 months. Actually, 63%. Such as witnessing anti-Semitic graffiti or vandalism, or experiencing online harassment, or hearing somebody repeat an anti-Semitic trope, such as Jews care too much about money, or that the Holocaust didn't happen, or that American Jews care more about Israel than about the United States. Now, just over half of those questioned in this poll said they felt less safe as Jews in America than they did 5 years ago. 5 years ago, very few respondents said that they felt unsafe. Now, NPR recently reported that with rising anti-Semitism, many American Jews are even conflicted about whether to publicly celebrate Jewish holidays like Hanukkah. The American Jewish Committee reported that 41% of Jews in America today feel unsafe, and that's up from 31% just a year ago. So this presentation will examine the history of anti-Semitism since the end of World War II and how we got to where we are today. So after more than half a century of increasing animosity towards Jews in this country, after 1945, anti-Semitism suddenly began to decline. So what were the reasons for this decline in anti-Semitism after the end of World War II? Well, in part, it was the result of the post-war prosperity in the United States. After World War II, Americans felt optimistic about the future, and so there was less of a need for scapegoats. In addition, the rabid anti-Semitism of the 1920s and 1930s, that receded after the end of the war, largely because of the Holocaust. When it became public knowledge that millions of Jews were murdered because of their religion, many Americans were more sympathetic to Jews. And part of the change in the condition of Jewish life in America was also the result of significant improvements in Catholic-Jewish relations. And that began with the historic meeting of the Second Vatican Council in 1965. The council repealed the historic church theme of collective responsibility for Jews in the death of Jesus. And that had been the source of anti-Semitism throughout the ages. And so the Second Vatican Council absolved Jews living today of the charge of deicide, of killing Christ. And that opened a path to improved relations between Christians and Jews. Now, while anti-Semitism in America never entirely disappeared, after World War II, anti-Semitism was viewed as beyond the pale. It was no longer socially acceptable. It was no longer mainstream. Cracks about Jews that used to be taken for granted, that became fewer in number. And anti-Semitism was downgraded from a problem to an irritant. The percentage of Americans who reported hearing recent criticism of Jews plummeted from 64% in 1946 to just 16% in 1951. Now, Hollywood had avoided the subject of anti-Semitism before the war because Jewish film executives were warned that making films about the subject would unleash another wave of anti-Semitism. But after the war, in 1947, two major films appeared that addressed the topic of anti-Semitism in America. One was Crossfire, and the other, which you are probably familiar with, was Gentleman's Agreement, which I believe won the Academy Award for 1947. It was produced by Darryl F. Zanuck, who was not Jewish. And this film, Gentleman's Agreement, unmasked the polite anti-Semitism by those who tried to hide their bigotry under the guise of gentility and conformity. Now, when this film was made, it was very controversial, particularly among the Jewish film moguls, and they even tried to buy the negative from Zanuck so that he would not release it, because these Jewish film moguls thought that a film about anti-Semitism would only stoke further anti-Semitism. But that was not the case. For 35 years, these Jewish film moguls had presented movies as an all-American industry, and they feared that the film, Gentleman's Agreement, would alienate audiences. But it turned out to be extremely sympathetic to the Jewish cause, and it was widely embraced by most Americans. But some associated with these two films actually missed the message of these films. So, for example, an assistant to the director of the film Crossfire thought the movie was pointless. He reasoned, quote, he said, "There's no anti-Semitism in America. If there were, why is it that all the money in America is controlled by Jewish bankers?" So here he's saying that there's no anti-Semitism in America because all the money in America is controlled by Jewish bankers. And a stagehand on the set of Gentleman's Agreement decided he would never again be rude to a Jew, quote, because he might turn out to be a Gentile. Again, missing the point. Now, in the 20 years between World War I and World War II, that was the worst of times for American Jews. But the 20 years following the end of World War II was a golden age for American Jewry. The decades following the war was a time of affluence and acceptance for many Jews in America. The job discrimination that prevented Jews from getting jobs in major professions, those restrictions ended after World War II. Housing restrictions against Jews eased, and quotas at the most elite universities were removed. And as a result, in the years following the end of World War II, Jews became prominent in the fields of law, medicine, journalism, business, politics, and even sports. When BESS MEYERSON won the Miss America contest in 1945, that seemed to open all sorts of possibilities in an America that had become home to the largest Jewish community in the world by 1945. The overwhelming majority of Jews of East European background ascended to white-collar status by the 1960s. And that was an upward mobility that far surpassed any other immigrant group. And the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 instilled pride among American Jews. But social anti-Semitism continued to keep Jews out of executive positions in insurance, banking, automobile manufacturing, utilities, oil, steel. Social acceptance in exclusive men's businesses and social clubs was also difficult for Jews to obtain. Before World War II, almost all of these social clubs barred Jews from becoming members, and about 2/3 of them continued to do so by the early 1960s. The period after World War II started out with some serious concerns for American Jews. In the early years of the Cold War, the House Un-American Activities Committee in 1947 went after alleged communist infiltration of the motion picture industry. And some believed that Congress did this, that is, they investigated the film industry because the film business was run almost exclusively by Jews. And 6 of the Hollywood 10, that was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee, were Jewish. Then, in 1951, the Rosenberg Spy Case threatened to reignite anti-Semitism. But despite the McCarthy Red Scare, there was no resurging wave of attacks against Jews in America as a result of the Rosenberg case. But anti-Semitism had not been entirely erased from people's hearts and minds. Many Americans were still anti-Semitic, but they didn't act on it, and they didn't verbalize it. Hostility towards Jews remained just beneath the surface in many typical American communities. Although quotas began to fall away after World War II, they did not entirely disappear until the 1960s. Scholarly studies continue to show a high correlation between anti-Semitism and devout Christianity. And that's despite the Vatican Council that absolved Jews from the crime of killing Christ. Throughout the post-war era, synagogues continued to be desecrated with Nazi symbols, although certainly less so than before the war. Nevertheless, by the 1970s, anti-Semitism indisputably was shifting to the margins of American society. While anti-Semitism significantly declined in most of the United States, it increased dramatically in the South after the 1954 Supreme Court decision to desegregate public schools and during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The activities undertaken by Jewish groups such as the ADL and the American Jewish Congress to end racial barriers, that offended many Southern whites. It also was unnerving to Southern Jewry. White supremacists lashed out against both Black and Jewish communities. George Lincoln Rockwell, founder of the American Nazi Party, even called for the deportation of all Black people to Africa and of so-called communist Jews to gas chambers. Between 1957 and 1967, temples were bombed in several southern cities, such as Charlotte, Birmingham, Nashville, Miami, and Atlanta. It was during that time that a Black Jewish coalition battled together for civil rights legislation. And that battle culminated in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But it was also around that same time that friction between Blacks and Jews would tear that alliance apart. Surveys conducted by the ADL revealed the one group among which anti-Semitism had significantly increased in the United States had been among African Americans. Now, it would seem that Blacks and Jews, both targets of discrimination and attack from the majority white Christian population, that Blacks and Jews would be natural allies, sort of siblings of oppression, and for many decades they were. But the alliance of blacks and Jews that created the NAACP and later Jewish involvement in the civil rights movement, that alliance began to break down by the late 1960s. At every level, Jews were engaged in the civil rights movement. Nearly half of the white freedom riders were Jewish. 45% of all whites who came to the South to push for civil rights were Jews, including Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, who were murdered in Mississippi in 1964, along with James Chaney. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. from Selma to Montgomery in 1965. So, why did this Black-Jewish alliance come apart? When many inner-city Blacks saw little improvement in their lives after the civil rights movement, Jews became a target of their frustration. To Black activists, police violence, the persistence of poverty and segregation suggested that white liberals couldn't be trusted, and Jews contributed one of the largest and most visible segments of liberal whites. Jews constituted one of the largest and most visible segments of liberal whites. And African Americans in the South had absorbed a white Protestant fundamentalist culture that blamed Jews for killing their savior and for not accepting Christianity. The main contact between African Americans and Jews was often in the form of landlords or shop owners or welfare workers and their Black clients. And some Blacks resented Jews, who they said were making a profit off their community, that is, Jewish stores in Black neighborhoods. Many Jewish-owned stores were targeted by Blacks in the riots of the 1960s. Also, many Jews participated in white flight, leaving inner-city neighborhoods for the suburbs, for better educational opportunities for their children. And that left their African-American neighbors feeling abandoned. And Blacks were then resentful of whites, and many of those whites were Jews who had fled to the wealthier suburbs. And there were those who questioned whether a genuine alliance between Blacks and Jews was ever possible because their conditions and position in society differed so much. By the 1960s, most Jews were well-educated and were part of the wealthiest ethnic groups in the country, whereas Blacks were the least educated and the most impoverished minority in America. As the disappointment mounted, many Blacks gravitated towards militants who were increasingly nationalistic and who focused on gaining control over institutions such as schools. Proponents of Black power pointed out that Black people could not achieve true freedom unless they led civil rights movements themselves. Otherwise, they said, white people retained a degree of power and authority over them. And so Black militants emphasized the need for Black self-sufficiency. In 1968, Black activists demanded community control over a school district in Brooklyn. And this school district that was now under community control dismissed veteran white teachers, most of whom were Jewish. In response, the New York City Teachers Union went on strike. And that strike pitted the Black community against the mostly Jewish Teachers Union. And that conflict represented the most vicious and visible Black-Jewish confrontation in American history. Jewish teachers were accused of committing genocide on Black children. The anti-Semitic slurs and racist retorts from striking teachers left a rift between the two communities, and it took decades to heal this rift. Also, the debate over affirmative action in the 1970s was another irritant in relations between Blacks and Jews. Jews equated affirmative action with the quotas that white Christians had used to keep Jews out of elite schools and professions. So many Jews opposed affirmative action, whereas many Blacks felt affirmative action based on quotas was essential for group progress. And once the hostility between Blacks and Jews came out into the open, some Black leaders vilified Jews with some extraordinarily hateful speech. And so some of you may remember that Jesse Jackson referred to New York City as Jaime Town, saying that's all Jaime wants to talk about is Israel. Every time you go to Jaime Town, that's all they want to talk about. And Minister Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam gave speeches laced with anti-Semitic references, and he proclaimed that Hitler was a very great man. Steve Coakley, an aide to the Chicago mayor, claimed that Jewish doctors were injecting the AIDS virus into Black babies, and that Jews were conspiring to take over the world, sort of like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion allegation. And few in the African-American community condemned these hateful remarks. Many Black leaders, in fact, expressed sympathy towards Palestinians in the conflict with Israel. They castigated Zionism as a colonial racist movement. And these tensions around Zionism came to a public head in 1977 when Andrew Young, a civil rights activist and the first African-American ambassador to the UN, he met secretly with representatives of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now, that meeting sparked an uproar. Jews were prominent in condemning Andrew Young for meeting with the PLO, and that resulted in President Carter asking Young to resign as US ambassador to the UN. But many in the Black community felt that Jews had forced Andrew Young's resignation. One of the lowest points in the relationship between Blacks and Jews occurred in 1991 in the Crown Heights riots in Brooklyn. Tensions between Blacks and Jews exploded into 3 days of riots that were directed at the Jewish community. Now, while the reasons for the rift between Blacks and Jews are complex, it's undeniable that for most of the 20th century, Jewish contacts with African Americans have almost always been on a superior subordinate relationship, as philanthropist to recipient, as shopkeeper to customer, as landlord to tenant, as employer to employee, as teacher to student, as welfare worker to client. And that relationship was bound to engender resentment on the part of Blacks. So what is the state of Black-Jewish relations today? Well, the relationship between the two communities today is complicated. It's characterized by both cooperation and conflict. On the positive side, with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, many Jews have taken active roles in the continuing struggle for racial justice, just as the Jewish community did in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement. On the other hand, anti-Semitism has been on the rise in recent years, including in parts of the Black community. In 2020, several prominent Black athletes and entertainers, including Deshaun Jackson, Nick Cannon, Ice Cube, they made anti-Semitic statements or posted them on social media. All of them subsequently apologized, with the exception of Ice Cube. And more recently, Kanye West said he wanted to go DEFCON 3 on Jewish people. Here's a quote, "I'm a bit sleepy tonight, but when I wake up, I'm going DEFCON 3 on Jewish people. The funny thing is I actually can't be anti-Semitic because Black people are actually Jews." You guys have toyed with me and tried to blackball anyone whoever opposes your agenda. And also basketball star Kyrie Irving posted a link to a film that was crammed with anti-Semitic tropes. So relations between Blacks and Jews continue to be complicated. So now let us take a look at anti-Semitism in the 21st century. Despite claims by some people that America is a Christian nation, it seemed that by the early 2000s, Jews had moved from the margins of society towards the mainstream of American life. In the year 2000, a major political party nominated not just an American Jew, but an observant Jew to be its vice presidential candidate. Joe Lieberman ran as the Democratic nominee for vice president on a ticket with Al Gore. By 2010, 3 of the 9 justices on the Supreme Court were Jewish. In the first decade and a half of the 21st century, anti-Semitic hate crimes certainly continued in this country, but they were isolated cases. They were not reflective of a general trend, at least in the first decade and a half of this century. Yet, yes, there were outrageous conspiracy theories, such as the one that insisted that Jews were behind the 9/11 attack, but these crackpot theories were limited to the lunatic fringe. But the financial crisis of 2008 revived conspiracy theories that Jews controlled the US government, that they were manipulating the economy, and that they threatened the American people. Posts and public comments on financial message boards, websites, and blogs perpetuated anti-Semitic stereotypes and conspiracy theories that alleged Jewish control of all banks in the United States and blamed Jews for the financial turmoil. In response to a poll that asked the question, how much were Jews to blame for the 2008 financial crisis, among non-Jewish respondents, 24.6% blamed Jews. That's 1 out of every 4 respondents who are not Jewish blame Jews for the 2008 financial crisis. A September 2008 video on YouTube that was entitled "The Court Jewsters," it displayed articles and pictures of failing banks and companies while repeatedly depicting the Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke, former Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, as well as other Jews, with implications that they led America into the financial crisis. But these accusations were not translated into increased attacks against individual Jews or attacks against Jewish institutions. The early years of this century witnessed wide-scale protests against globalization, the spread of the flow of financial products, goods, technology, information, and jobs across national borders and cultures. The protest was directed against large multinational corporations that were unregulated and that wielded political power through trade agreements and deregulated financial markets. Over the centuries, Jews, as we have seen, having been expelled from one country after another, Jews relied on global business and international social connections for the survival of Jewish cultural and religious life. And because some Jews benefited from globalization and free market capitalism, the anti-globalist movement has been tinged with a fair degree of anti-Semitism. The term globalism has been used in reference to Jewish people having allegiances not to their countries of origin, but to a global conspiracy. The term globalist is often used as a derogatory code word for Jews. It evokes this anti-Semitic myth, falsely accusing mysterious agents of multiculturalism and international cooperation and trying to weaken America from within. This is Marjorie Taylor Greene accusing Jews of being globalists. The backlash against globalization has united a variety of political elements from the left to the far right, some of whom claim to oppose the so-called Jewish world order. George Soros, a Hungarian-born Jewish philanthropist living in the United States and a major proponent of globalization, he's been demonized and vilified by critics on the political right. They claim he is the mastermind of a vast globalist conspiracy that seeks to restore the world to Jewish control, and in the process, to kill millions and reduce humanity to slavery. It should be pointed out that growing numbers of individual Jews, most on the liberal left end of the Jewish political and religious spectrum, are also critical of globalization. Nevertheless, prior to 2010, despite an upswing of anti-Semitic incidents in many parts of the world, America was near the top of a list of countries where Jews suffered least from anti-Semitism. That's prior to 2010. Neo-Nazi and white supremacist groups dominated some internet sites, and Holocaust denial certainly remained problematic, but really, until recently, anti-Semitism was not a threat to the security and well-being of Jews living in America. It certainly paled to the grim situation of Jews in France, who had been attacked by Muslim youths, or to the emergence of anti-Semitic political parties in Hungary and Greece. And it paled to the anti-Semitism that exists in the Arab world. But all of that changed in 2016 with the emergence of the so-called alt-right, a grouping of right-wing extremists who embraced racist nationalism and actively infused ordinary symbols and memes with anti-Semitic meanings. This group exploited public platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube in an effort to make their messages mainstream. With few or no restrictions on hate speech, or that were being enforced by these social media companies, a handful of social networking platforms and online forums became appealing destinations for anti-Semites of all stripes, allowing them to disseminate their views openly, no matter how bigoted or violent. And all of that coincided with the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the increasingly hostile tone of political debate in the United States. Now, let's go back to that chart that the ADL compiled of anti-Semitic incidents from 2012 to 2021. So you can see that compared to 2012, the number of anti-Semitic incidents in 2021 increased exponentially. And in fact, the number of anti-Semitic incidents in 2021 represented a 34% increase from 2020. It averages out to more than 7 anti-Semitic incidents per day. In August 2017, white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and other like-minded extremists gathered for the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, with chants of "Jews will not replace us." And that phrase evoked the long-standing white supremacist claim that Jews conspire to destroy pure white American society. In 2018, an attack on Pittsburgh's Tree of Life synagogue resulted in the murder of 11 Jews. It represents the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in US history. And the following year, in 2019, there was a shooting at a synagogue in Poway that left one woman killed and 3 injured. And then in that same year, there was a shooting at a kosher grocery store in Jersey City, in which 5 people were killed. And last year, in Colleyville, Texas, 4 people were taken hostage by a British Muslim at a synagogue. Now, there's been much debate over whether former President Trump bears personal responsibility for this dramatic uptick in attacks against Jews. His defenders argue that the former president can't possibly be anti-Semitic because his daughter, Ivanka, is married to an Orthodox Jew, and she herself has converted to Judaism. And therefore, Trump's grandchildren are Jewish. They also point out that Trump was responsible for recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and he was instrumental in fashioning the Abraham Accords, in which several Arab countries restored relations with Israel. So these are the arguments that have been brought up to make the point that Trump could not possibly be anti-Semitic. But critics argue that Trump has had a long history with anti-Semitism. As a candidate in 2016, he retweeted messages from anti-Semitic supporters, and he refused to clearly distance himself from the Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, David Duke. He said he knew nothing about David Duke, when in fact, they had met on prior occasions. In the 2016 presidential race, Trump tweeted an image of Hillary Clinton surrounded by money with the words, "most corrupt candidate ever." And those words were inside a 6-pointed star, the shape of the Star of David. And just days after Trump was warned about an alleged globalist conspiracy, his campaign ran an ad showing images of 3 Jews: the billionaire philanthropist George Soros, the then chair of the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, and Goldman Sachs CEO Lloyd Blankfein, while the ad warned of global special interests. As Trump rallied behind the slogan, "America First," that slogan echoed prominent anti-Semites during World War II. And Trump's words found power in the alt-right and among hate groups like the Ku Klux Klan, QAnon, and the Proud Boys. Trump fueled anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in 2018 when he told reporters, quote, "A lot of people say George Soros was financing the migrant caravan massing on the southern border." And following the neo-Nazi white supremacist demonstration in Charlottesville, Trump pronounced that there were very fine people on both sides. Now, he regularly speaks about American Jews as if Israel is their country rather than the United States. He warned American Jews to, quote, "get their act together and appreciate what they have in Israel before it is too late." He also complained that Jewish Americans who vote Democratic are very disloyal to Israel. Now, perhaps most damning was last month's dinner, well, actually a few months ago, Trump's dinner with Kanye West and with Nick Fuentes, a right-wing provocateur and a known Holocaust denier. Now, Trump claimed he didn't know who Fuentes was, but he has yet to apologize for meeting with him and Kanye West. So as a result, anti-Semitism is becoming mainstream into American culture as celebrities, politicians, and media personalities increasingly amplify anti-Semitic rhetoric, or they give platforms to known anti-Semites. Extremists reportedly have been emboldened by ex-President Trump's adoption of specific elements of their rhetoric and his dismissal of their hate. such as his use of terms like globalist or his campaign slogan, America First. But anti-Semitism today doesn't only come from the political right. It also comes from the left. The university has traditionally served as an enclave for inquiry and the free exchange of ideas. The university is a venue where scholarly debate is and should be actively encouraged. However, speakers on some college campuses have sometimes delivered anti-Semitic tirades that have been protected under the banner of academic freedom. In some cases, campus anti-Semitism is related to anti-Israel sentiment, but in other cases, it's not. On many campuses, anti-Israeli or anti-Zionist propaganda has been disseminated, and some of this propaganda includes traditional anti-Semitic elements, including age-old anti-Jewish stereotypes and defamation of Jews. Expressions of animosity directed at Jews and the propagation of negative Jewish stereotypes should not be protected by academic freedom. Rather, they should fall under the category of hate speech, which most colleges and universities do condemn. But unfortunately, some college administrators fail to distinguish adequately between debate that enriches and elevates the mind and speech that is intended to demean and vilify. The failure to condemn and counter hatred on college campuses not only contributes to the spread of hate-filled rhetoric, but it causes victimized students to feel defensive, angry, and isolated. Over 40% of Jewish American college students report that they have experienced or are aware of anti-Semitism on their campuses in the last 12 months. Jewish students are increasingly ostracized, kept from campus organizations because of their assumed support for Israel or Zionism. Last year, Hillel tracked more than 500 instances of Jewish students and their campus institutions being subjected to anti-Semitic harassment, discrimination, and attack. More than 3 times the number of incidents recorded when today's seniors were starting college just a few years ago. This challenge is also aggravated by the intense and ongoing demonization of Israel on many college campuses. And on many college campuses, Jewish students are targeted and marginalized, often regardless of their views about their relationship to Israel. Now, criticism of Israel frequently devolves into classic anti-Semitism, not always, but it does many times, by invoking conspiracy theories and long-standing tropes that hold all Jewish students collectively responsible for perceived injustices committed by the Jewish state. Such activity typically has made all identified Jews targets on campus, regardless of their position on Middle Eastern issues or their level of religious observance or political engagement. When it comes to Israel, there is wide disagreement, even among Jews, over what constitutes anti-Semitism. So when does criticism of the Israeli government and anti-Zionism become anti-Jewish? Now, I think it's important to distinguish between certain forms of anti-Israel sentiment on the one hand and anti-Semitism on the other. It is possible to criticize the policies of the Israeli government without harboring animosity towards Jews in general. In fact, some of the harshest critics of Netanyahu's policies are Jews, both in Israel and in the United States. But for some people, the distinction between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism is intertwined. Israel is a country like any other, with policies that some people support and others oppose. Many American Jews are often critical of Israelis' policies. The Israeli press is often critical of its own government's policies and politicians. And as stated, so are many Israeli citizens. So criticism of Israel is not inherently anti-Semitic. But when Israel is compared to Nazi Germany, as in this cartoon, that what Israel is doing to the Palestinians is somehow the same as the systematic extermination of Jews by the Nazis during the Second World War, that is not only historically inaccurate, it is extremely offensive and anti-Semitic. Although the conflict between Israel and Palestinians is often horrendous, it cannot possibly be compared to the extermination and genocide. And making these comparisons is really anti-Semitic. Criticism of Israel often ties in with anti-Semitic myths and symbols and tropes, such as this cartoon that appeared in The Guardian of an Israeli soldier killing a Palestinian, but sort of restoking the allegation that Jews killed Christ. So using such images and symbols to criticize Israel really evokes memories of past persecutions and memories of the Holocaust. And they fit in with the long history of anti-Semitism. When Jews are targeted and attacked, and Jewish institutions are vandalized because of Israel's policies and actions, that too is anti-Semitism. During and following the Hamas-incited flare-up in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in May of 2021, anti-Semitic incidents surged in the United States and around the world. On May 18, 2021, in Los Angeles, a mob dressed in Hamas-inspired garb asked patrons at a sushi restaurant, "Are you Jewish?" And then they launched a violent attack on customers whom they thought were Jewish. On May 20th, 2021, in New York, a man wearing a yarmulke was punched, kicked, sprayed with pepper spray by several men who yelled, "Go back to Israel." So, in conclusion, anti-Semitism is a real and growing problem in America today. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks extremism, reports there are 939 known hate groups across America today, many of which, in fact, most of which, target Jews. Uniformed guards are hired to protect the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington. Synagogues in this country sometimes have police patrols and concrete barriers to protect against terrorist attacks. Hatred of Jews becomes truly ominous only when those in authority sanction anti-Semitism or choose to remain silent and look the other way. Until recently, government officials and political leaders in this country could be counted on to raise their voices in protest, to activate the machinery of government to combat these forces of hate. But today, anti-Semitic tropes resonate from some government officials, such as Marjorie Taylor Greene, who charged that Jewish lasers from outer space were responsible for starting forest fires in California. So while anti-Semitism in the United States today represents a real danger, I think it's also important to put things in perspective. Today, there are no debates about a Jewish problem in America as there was in the 1930s. There are no mainstream political campaigns against Jews in America today. There are no anti-Semitic demagogues of national stature like Father Coughlin in the 1930s. Now, while anti-Semitic incidents are certainly increasing, Americans overall espouse less anti-Semitic views than they did 60 years ago. So the ADL reported that in 1960, 29% of Americans were considered anti-Semitic. In 2019, the ADL's most recent year of measuring anti-Semitism, the number was its lowest ever in the United States at 11%. But there is also no doubt that today there is less inhibition over expressing anti-Jewish rhetoric than in past decades. A 2020 Pew survey asked respondents whether they personally feel less safe or more safe as a Jewish person in America today compared to 5 years ago. Just over half of Jewish respondents, 53%, said they feel less safe today than 5 years ago. That alone should serve as a wake-up call, not only for all American Jews, but for all defenders of democracy in this country. And that concludes my take on anti-Semitism in America since 1945. So at this point, we can stop, and Jerry, you can moderate questions and comments.
Okay. Wait, let me get everybody on the screen. Hi, everybody. So does anybody want to make a comment or ask a question? You can unmute yourself, or I can help you unmute yourself. Go ahead, Deborah.
Has the ADL or any other groups involved with following anti-Semitism, have they found any strategies to teach or help people have a better understanding of what we are and what we aren't? I know there was a person who, I don't know if it was with Jews or blacks, but I think, I know, he was a skinhead, and he now teaches out of the Holocaust Museum in LA.
That's right.
And I think if you know anything about that, it seems to me
I
we
do.
really need to do that.
Yeah, if you go on the ADL website, adl.org, there are links as to what we can do to help combat anti-Semitism. The Holocaust Museum in Washington has a link to what we can do about Holocaust denial, how we could refute Holocaust deniers. So there are strategies. Now, there is no single strategy that's foolproof, but it's very interesting that the Museum of Tolerance in Los Angeles had this former skinhead who apparently saw the light and recognized the damage that skinheads had done, and so he meets regularly with K through 12 school children, and he talks about the dangers of falling down the rabbit hole of these anti-Semitic websites, which is what got him into it. And so, yeah, there are things that can be done. Also, the Southern Poverty Law Center has strategies to combat hate groups. So I'm glad you brought that up, Deborah.
Anybody else? Well, I wonder if you could comment on how the level, you had a graph on the level of anti-Semitism going down significantly over, I don't remember what years it was, but it
From
was
1960 to
2019.
2019.
okay.
Okay.
Yet Jews feel more fearful of anti-Semitic acts and anti-Semitism, and I wonder, that doesn't seem to correlate. But I wonder if you have any comment about that.
Yeah, I think it wasn't what the ADL was asking about wasn't about anti-Semitic attacks. It was about whether you feel that anti-Semitism is a major problem in American society. Now, 1960 wasn't that far removed from the 1930s and 1940s, so it's not surprising that almost 30% of respondents felt that anti-Semitism was a major problem in American society. And even though there have been an increase in anti-Semitic attacks, certainly since 2016, apparently those respondents, and again, we always have to be careful of these polls because they're not asking everyone, they're asking a certain select group. They felt that anti-Semitism was not a major problem in American society. Now, they may have experienced some type of exposure to anti-Semitism, whether, seeing swastikas on synagogues or seeing posts on social media, but they did not feel that that constitutes a major problem for Jews in America. So I understand your question that it seems as if anti-Semitism certainly is on the increase, and I think we can't deny that. But not everybody feels that that is a major problem for Jews in America. I mean, one thing that I find particularly distressing is that in the 1930s, and even for part of the 1940s, anti-Semites felt no compunction to filter their thoughts. People were openly anti-Semitic, but that disappeared after World War II. It no longer was socially acceptable. Somebody who was openly anti-Semitic would be ridiculed, but that is not the case today, I think. I think, there still is some social condemnation, but not in all quarters. And another development, which I didn't mention, and that is the rise of Christian nationalism. Christian nationalists believe that America is a Christian country. And some on the extreme of Christian nationalists think that it's a country only for Christians. That is, they would deport non-Christians. 52% of Republicans claim some form of allegiance to this Christian nationalism. And that doesn't mean that 52% of Republicans want to deport non-Christians, only the people on the extreme. But I think for Jews in America, that's troubling. America was not founded as a Christian nation. In fact, separation of church and state is clear in the Constitution, that religion should be no bar to political office or to the right to vote. Yet, the irony is that many of these Christian nationalists are also evangelicals who strongly support the state of Israel for the wrong reasons, because they believe that when Armageddon comes, then that's when the second coming will come about. So they support Israel in hopes of a cataclysmic battle between Israelis and Palestinians and Arabs that will result in this Armageddon that will bring about the second coming.